In a world where AI is providing all of the templates and advice that startups can need, how are you continuing to add value?
Yeah, I think this is a super relevant question. So, Fred Wilson from USV, which is a pretty popular VC fund, he's a legendary investor, has been there, since the beginning of tech as an investor. He just did a blog post yesterday that has uh, lawyers a bit worried and scared. He essentially took all of his closing binders and uploaded them into Google Notebook LM and essentially had the AI advise on a series seed um, without lawyers. Essentially, what happened is he went and he asked his lawyers to help him with this deal. The lawyers quoted him $50,000 and he was like, I think you should do it for less than five. And when they said no, he took his entire history of his closing binders, uploaded them into his AI knowledge base, and had the AI essentially flag the deal issues. And this has made quite a storm in the legal space. A number of lawyers like Chris Harvey, pretty also legendary lawyer, mostly for emerging funds. He did a post on LinkedIn, asking the legal community, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And lawyers across the board are worried in terms of the impact that AI will have. I think the current state of AI isn't up to par. It still advises in misdirected ways. For example, we were just advising a client on a buyout yesterday, and the AI is just like feeding him completely wrong information about qualified small business stock and how to structure the deal, which is actually like a huge pain as a lawyer when people bring AI responses. So I guess to answer your question, how am I adding value to my clients? I think that the state of AI's responses isn't up to par, and for me, actually, I put a lot of faith and trust in the human value, which I think that AI won't be able to replicate. There's one area that I think that AI won't really be able to help with respect to. I think another area, and I think lawyers across the board in this conversation, in this, in the conversation around the impact of AI on the legal industry is, listen, someone like Fred, he's been doing these deals since the 90s. So he's seen everything under the sun. He's worked with all the major law firms. He's done hundreds and hundreds of these deals. So someone like Fred, he probably doesn't even need the AI to advise him as to what the issues are in the deal. And so for him, he probably at this point could do the deal without the AI and without a lawyer. But for most founders only raise a handful of times in their lifetime. And so their experience with raising funds is going to be quite limited. And so those more novice founders are always going to need guidance and hand holding and direction, even where AI can do the job of a lawyer. That's one area where lawyers, I think, will always add value, is maybe with more inexperienced founders. The other area, as I mentioned, is the human element. So as fundraisers get more complex, uh, usually there might be more investors involved or more parties involved, and there are complex multi-party negotiations. And it's actually in those places that I think that lawyers like myself will continue to be able to add value, is in the human kind of contact, connection, negotiation, those areas where I think AI won't really be able to fill those gaps.
So it sounds to me like you feel lawyers are going to be more useful as you get to series A, B, C, and beyond, but a lot of the work that lawyers typically do now for pre-seed and seed is going to go away.
I think that lawyers have been removed from the angel pre-seed, since quite a long time now. For those $250,000, $500,000 rounds, most founders, when I talk to them, they're like, "I don't think I need a lawyer. I just use this Y Combinator template. All I need to do is plug in what the post money valuation is and the investment amount, and that's it." Um, Now, my advice and guidance to those founders is, it's usually not that easy. You have to, there are steps, there's a process. You have to make sure investors are accredited. You have to file Form D, but with the SEC. But yeah, I mean, I think lawyers have for sure, for the most part, been removed from angel pre-seed for quite some time.
Hey, business leaders and marketers, what if your brand could be featured right here? This ad spot could be yours. This channel is watched by a dedicated audience of ambitious founders, executives, and professionals who are actively looking for tools and services to help their business grow. If you want to put your brand in front of this highly dedicated audience that's difficult to reach, I'm currently looking for a few strategic partners for the channel. To learn more about sponsorship opportunities, click the link in the description. Let's grow together. I think what a lot of founders, especially first time founders, don't realize is that there's a lot more than just the fundraise itself, because when you're early on you don't know what you don't know, and so there are legal things around partnerships and operating agreements, and those are things that are not just in a bootstrap to profit type business. Those are also in a startup. It's, an incorporated entity is an incorporated entity. It doesn't matter how you choose to fundraise. The law is still the law, and they're missing a lot of those things, and so they make a lot of mistakes around structuring their partnership or structuring their share option plan, or not filing the Form D, or how they set up the banking system, or just a number of things could go awry. I've heard of instances of founders where one of the partners got divorced from their wife, and the wife is now claiming this person's shares or some of the person's shares, which would put them in a situation that that wife has now a lot of power to make decisions in the business, because there was nothing prepared. So, what are some of the bad or ugly things you've seen from people not knowing, or I guess trusting AI, and not having a human to tell them the reality that got them in trouble?
Yeah, I think, for example, one case that we're actively working on right now, super smart founder, ex Fang, has worked at, all the major tech companies, um, has a profitable company. Um, it's not an AI company, but to the surprise of the times, but he essentially, founders can really tie themselves in knots, even if it doesn't have necessarily legal implications. His fundraise has been held up, and the investor is actually seriously considering not investing, because as he was building his company, um, he thought, I don't need to use a lawyer. I often hear from people as well, like, oh, like my whole family are lawyers, as if like, you know, you can download legal knowledge by like osmosis or something. Like, and so, that thinking, that mental model made him tie himself in knots. So what he ended up doing was, he had a company. There was some special licenses that he got for that company. He wanted to change the name of the company, but instead of, shutting the company down, he realized that the licenses could transfer with the business. and that that he could potentially make some money off of selling that entity that had those licenses. And so he found a buyer for that entity, but he used some template off of Rocket Lawyer. That template was, he had started a corporation. The template that he used was for an LLC for membership units, which are a completely different type of equity than stock, which is what a corporation has. So he ended up selling this entity, used the wrong agreement type that he found on Rocket Lawyer. Didn't think about the potential IP issues in that the two names of the companies are incredibly similar, and went ahead, sold the company, and now wants to get investment. As I mentioned, his investment has been held up for the last few weeks, and even the investor's lawyer is like, this is probably one of the biggest messes that I've ever seen. This is like beyond the typical standard mess that founders have, where you go in and they haven't documented their IP assignments, for example, or their cap table equity hasn't been properly issued, or those are the typical founder messes. But this guy has like really tied himself up in, and it just so happened that it's going to work out for him because him and the buyer's relationship is really strong. But let's say the buyer and his relationship was not strong and he wasn't able to fix these issues. That would have been a big problem for him. So that's one example. Another example is founders. There was a really big case on Twitter actually, last year, where there were these founders that had been admitted to Y Combinator. It was like these two 18-year-old kids. Um, and essentially, they had forked some technology, some AI wrapper, essentially. And they didn't read the source licensing for the code. And essentially, they commercialized source code that was supposed to be open source, and they got absolutely destroyed on Twitter. And these two kids um, were like so brash and bravado, and I will never forget this line. This line will forever be burned into my memory. They're getting like totally flamed on Twitter. Like Twitter was ablaze with people being like, "You guys have no idea what you're doing. This has like serious legal implications." And the founder had the audacity, which by the way, he deleted this tweet after the fact, but he had the audacity to respond to all these people tearing him to pieces by saying something like, "We busy building right now, can't be bothered with legal." And that was like, that response, just the internet completely tore him to shreds. So it's these sorts of things. I mean, you lose credibility with the community, you lose credibility with your investors. A lot of times legal can have implications quite far down the road that you aren't aware of until it becomes an issue. So I can give you two more kind of nightmare examples. There was a founder, ex Microsoft, um, and he was building this marketplace. And this is a super typical story. This happens time and time again. And the fix is easy. The fix is easy. It's like $2,500 to a lawyer. You never have to deal with this issue. But again, you know, these tools like Stripe Atlas, so on and so forth, make it accessible, and accessible feels safe. So, false sense of safety. Anyway, two founders. He was the developer. The other guy was the business guy. He left his job at Microsoft. Other guy kept his full-time job. Um, and when they would talk, there was a lot of excitement around this company that they were building that was getting traction. But what the guy found was he was spending 40, 60, 80 hours a week, whereas the other guy would skip meetings, would not do any of the things that he said that he would do in terms of, generating the business and the sales and so on and so forth. But when they would have conversations, the guy who was doing nothing would be like, I'm fully invested, I'm putting in the work, blah blah blah. But as I mentioned, when the other guy would look, he would be like, he's not showing up to any meetings. He's not hitting any of the KPIs we said that he was going to hit. I don't see literally any effort. But they both had split the equity 50-50 outright, no vesting. So what ended up happening was he had to go get a valuation of the company because the founder wouldn't give up the equity. He's like, no, this equity is mine. I own 50% of this company. And when they would talk, he would actually uh, get super angry. He'd be like, what do you mean I'm not doing anything? I'm like super into this company. I'm like giving it all I have. And it's like, where's the results? There's no results. Anyway, what ended up happening was he had to go get a valuation of the company, and he ended up paying him something like $100,000 to buy this guy's equity for doing nothing. And that's a typical story. This happens frequently. And the fix is super simple. When you start your entity, you get an IP assignment and you issue the founder's stock with a 4-year vest and a 1-year cliff. Super simple.
Yeah.
$2,500. That's what it costs to get it from a lawyer. Or you could go to Clerky and get it for like 800.
I remember talking about these things internally in my startup. I was the only person who started the company and put money into it. And so I was naturally 100% owner. And then it was up to me to decide, who would get equity and how that would work. And I was aware of this vesting schedule, so I didn't have those issues. Um, I also was aware of the licensing issues because my CTO was like, he constantly had this spreadsheet updated, and my COO also insisted on having it because we had, when we were fundraising, we had investors asking us, for everything. And so we were able to present all of the third-party libraries we were using and what their licenses were. So we knew if there was anything that was going to prevent us from commercialization or things like that. And we had to decide, did we want to outsource, open source anything or keep it all closed source? And, we had different discussions around that because like my CTO wanted us to open source some things. And I was like, no, why the hell would I do that? That doesn't make any sense. So definitely had those discussions. Thankfully, none of them impacted us. The only annoying thing that impacted us that ended up killing us was that one of our investors signed an agreement and then didn't pay us all of the money he promised.
Yep, that happens.
And so we had planned for, 18 months with a month by month breakdown of how we were going to spend that money. And we started to hire people and implement that plan with the promise that the rest of the money was coming any minute, only to have drips and drabs over the next year, but never even close to the full amount. And we couldn't get new investors to come on board because we hadn't launched and we didn't have customers or revenue, even though we had a waiting list of 200 companies with about 5,000 employees. So we had 5,000 seats waiting to do trials. We could have easily gotten to a 7 or 8 figure ARR status through those seats, had assuming they all converted, and yet we weren't able to serve them, and we weren't able to stay alive because of that. And that was really, really frustrating because even today, years later, I talk to people, they're like, what were you doing? And I told them, and they're like, that's awesome, like that's still extremely relevant right now. We just didn't have the money to do it, and to start over now would be insane. So that's why I don't run companies anymore. I just advise and consult. It's way easier than being a founder. I think whoever does it has to be insane to do it. In a good way, kind of. Uh, so, so what are some good examples you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, the good examples are um, okay. So we had a founder. Um, Actually, this is a super interesting case in that I always say that they're one of my favorite clients. Very rare, but incredibly profitable. They do almost 3 million a year in ARR, and at the time they went to go fundraise, they were already doing 1 million ARR. Um, they had worked with us from the very beginning. Originally, they came to us as an LLC, but we had to convert them over into a corporation. But then they realized that a lot of their customers were high net worth individuals because they operate in the agency, marketing agencies and that sort of thing, digital agencies. And they essentially, did a fundraise where they went out to their customer base and they were like, "Hey, we're opening our fundraising round," and they were able to raise over $600,000 in like 30 days. Um, Super fast. Their customers already love the product so much, so they were like happy to invest. And we had set them up properly. As I mentioned, they had originally incorporated as an LLC. This is another thing that I think a lot of startup founders do is they listen to maybe some accountant or something like that, and the accountant is like, oh, avoid double taxation, just start as an LLC. But LLCs are not investable entities in the startup space. VCs will not invest in LLCs. They will only invest in Delaware C corporations, and there are reasons for that. The two primary reasons are most VC funds have pension funds, and those pension funds have tax liabilities that LLCs impact. And so VC funds cannot risk impacting their VC fund LPs. So that's one reason. Another reason is LLCs don't issue stock, they have equity, which are in the form of units, but LLCs are not equipped to issue stock or different classes of stock. So that's another reason why VCs will not invest in LLCs. LLCs are not equipped to issue equity the same way that C Corps are. So that's why um, startup founders specifically, should always incorporate as Delaware C Corps. But anyway, so we had this client. They were, I call them as close to a perfect client as possible. They understood what they had to do. They had to convert from an LLC to a C Corp. I think oftentimes a lot of founders feel a certain way about that. For them, it was a simple conversation like, hey, this isn't going to work. So we converted them over, which is a fairly standard process. There's a stateside conversion process. Essentially, you file a document with the state of Delaware. You file a document with the incorporation state, and then essentially the LLC ceases to exist and it transforms into a Delaware C corp. From there, they posted on social media, "Hey, we're opening up our fundraising round," which for the SEC, this is a 506C fundraise, which is a general solicitation. They got a huge amount of interest. They filled up their pipeline. And then the founder went through systematically, um, had pitches with each of those people that indicated that they were interested in investing. Then they were handed off to us. We provided them with the accredited investor questionnaire. We verified that they're accredited investors. You can also use a platform like InvestReady, which is an online platform that verifies accreditation. And then we sent them the safe. Once they raised the total 600K, we filed the Form D. Or actually, we filed the Form D within 15 days of the first safe being signed for the total fundraise amount. Um, but yeah, that was last year. as I mentioned, they were doing about a million in ARR. They're now doing 3 million in ARR, and they're actually going to raise their. They're going on to raise their 2 million seed, and they're in the process of that right now. So that's an example of a near perfect fundraise, and I can give you some more examples.
I've never heard of anyone going to social media to do that. Normally, startups don't have a network, and so they have to build it from scratch or find people that have it and have them be part of the process. Um, so it's kind of like a crowdfunding, except crowdfunding is doesn't have to be accredited investors. So it's interesting. What service were they providing?
They build an AI agent. It's a qualification tool.
Okay. So they made their clients their investors. It's interesting because for a business like that, like you just use revenue to generate more revenue. You don't typically need to raise money and sell equity. So it's a bit weird for me that they would go and do that. I mean, I know a number of companies that are like, yeah, we're gonna raise money. And I'm like, why? You're profitable and like you're growing fast. Why do you need like why can't you just go and get, a small business association loan? Or like why don't you get venture debt or working capital? Like why do you need to sell equity? And they do. I don't know why.
Well, I think venture debt or any sort of debt works really well when you figured out your unit economics around customer acquisition. If you haven't necessarily figured out your unit economics around customer acquisition, I think it can be a bit daunting for a startup founder to go and essentially have to be responsible for repayment of the loan. Whereas, like, if you know for every dollar that you put towards acquiring a customer, you're going to get 10 back, like, yeah, why would you go raise equity? But I think equity makes more sense when you still have a lack of clarity around your growth metrics.
Mm. What's the most important thing you've learned in your career?
Most important thing I've learned in my career. That's quite a broad question. Let me see. Interesting. I think uh, always I think it's so important, and this is kind of cliche and it's going to make me cringe a little bit to say it, but I think like being open to learning from as many different sources and places and uh and 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 areas of knowledge is incredibly important because you never know how you're going to utilize all the different um different types of knowledge. So I study psychology, I study marketing, I study business, I study economics, I study design, I study fashion, I look at pop culture. I'm always looking to every area because somehow it's all going to interconnect for me, and that like voracious desire for learning is where my continual growth and expansion comes from. So I think that is probably the most important lesson that I've learned in my career.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this insight, I've handpicked another video for you right here on the screen. For more actionable strategies that get you real results, hit subscribe.